Let's build an API. My name is Ben Deckery. This is Building Hoist, episode 3. In the last two episodes, we integrated Sanity's headless CMS and Auth0's authorization. Next episode, we're going to be integrating Stripe. But before we can get to that point, we need an API that our application can talk to in order to communicate with the Auth0 Management API and with the Stripe API. Let's get straight into it. Before we get started, I just want to do a quick shout out to Auth0 for letting me create these videos as part of my work. Hoist isn't an Auth0 product, but they're really keen to see it succeed and maybe even use it one day. I also want to let you know about a hackathon that they're running from the 7th until the 9th of August. There are going to be thousands of dollars worth of prizes and swag given away, and we're partnering with the likes of DigitalOcean, Vercel, Ionic, Gatsby, AWS, and Microsoft. If you want to find out more, there's a link in the description below. At the end of the last episode, we got to the point where we had the Sanity headless CMS integrated. This gave us the program listing down at the bottom here and the actual program pages, some image manipulation and resizing, and also, currently still only available on the 404 pages, we created 3 plans that people could subscribe to. The next logical step is to implement a payment and subscription mechanism, which we'll be using Stripe for. But we'll do that in the next episode, because before we get to that, there's a little bit of preparation that I want to do. With Auth0 integration, we already have a login mechanism, but we're going to need to find some way of linking that user to the Stripe customer ID in the Stripe system. We could implement that through another database, or maybe even put that into Sanity. But in this case, what I'm going to do is simply use the app metadata section of the user object in Auth0. Let's have a look and see what that looks like. If we open up the user here, we can see there's a user metadata and an app metadata section. These allow us to store information against this particular user profile. The user metadata is for things like user preferences, things that the user potentially has read-write access to. So we don't want to store things like the Stripe customer ID in here, because we don't want the user being able to change their own Stripe customer ID. There are vulnerabilities down the track if we choose that option. We can put it in the app metadata though. The app metadata area can't be updated by the user, but only by another application that has access to the Auth0 Management API. If we look on the APIs tab over here, every new tenant automatically has the Auth0 Management API set up as an API. And if we look inside, we can see that the machine-to-machine connections, we don't have any clients yet that are able to talk to the API. So let's do that. First thing we need to do is actually create another API for our Express API that we're going to be creating. We'll give this name Hoist API, and we need to give an identifier. Now, normally what we do is we'd create something like localhost port 8000, that's the Gatsby application, port 3000, standard port that most NPM applications run on. We would then configure Gatsby's Auth0 integration to specify this identifier as the audience for the token, which means that the token that gets sent back to our Gatsby application can actually be used by Gatsby or React to talk to our API. Now, this identifier doesn't actually need to be the domain that our API runs on. It can be any domain. In fact, it can be any string. By convention, we'll give it a domain, though, for us to be able to specify in the audience. What I'm going to do in this instance here, so I'm actually going to change this to be what I anticipate the API to be in our QA or staging environment. And that way, when we go into production or go into staging, when we push it into a public hosted environment, it'll be ready to go, and I won't need to create another API configuration in Auth0. So I suspect it's going to be dev.api.hoist.earth. So we'll just put that in. We're going to stick with the RS-256 algorithm, create that. And we're pretty much done at this point in terms of the configuration on Auth0. We've got the example Express app here. So let's go ahead now and jump into the console and create a new project. So we'll go back up into the main projects directory and we'll make a directory called Hoist API. This is a brand new project. Some people will store their APIs and their applications in the same code repository. I prefer to keep them separate because then it also means that it makes it easy for me to be able to deploy them to separate environments. My plan for this project is to continue having the Gatsby app hosted on Netlify, but to deploy the API on Vercel. Let's go into the Hoist API directory now. And the first thing we need to do is we're going to need to install some modules over here. So we can see we need Express, Express JWT, and JWKS RSA. So let's install these. We'll initialize a new npm project here, and then we'll install Express, Express JWT and JWKSRSA. While that's loading in the background, oh, that's done already. We're just going to start a code environment here, JS code. There we go. So the first thing we'll want to do is create a new file, and I'm just going to do a very bog standard Express app here. I'm not going to go into the best practices in terms of how to break it down. All I want to do is get to a point where the React app is able to send data into the Auth0 API. So we're going to create an index.js file here for us to define the entire Express application. So let's jump back into the code here. I'm just going to copy all of this and paste it into our editor here, and we'll have a look now what this is doing. We're requiring the Express module, and from that we're instantiating a new application. We're also bringing in the Express JWT module and the JWKS RSA module. The Express JWT module allows Express to examine the bearer token that gets sent in with requests, which will contain the JSON Web Token, and it exposes to us this method here that allows it to evaluate that token and use a secret to verify whether or not the signature is valid. The secret is defined in a well-known URL endpoint. So the .well-known here is used by a number of different systems. Authorization and the Auth0 protocol is just one of them. And if you go to jwks.json at .well-known on any standards compliant identity provider, you'll find something that looks a little bit like this. And in here you can see that we have a couple of public keys, and these can be used to verify that signature. Using this to define the JWKS or the JSON Web Keyset URI allows this JWKS module to pull the secret out and pass it back into the JWT function. The JWT function also receives an audience, which is the audience for the API itself. This is to verify that the token is actually intended for our API and not some other system. It also receives an issuer, which is the name or the URL of the identity provider endpoint. For us, that's our Hoist dev URL here, and a list of algorithms. The result of this object here is stored in JWT check, which we can pass directly into the entire application to protect every single endpoint. The alternative to that is we can also put it into the second parameter here of any of the app.get or app.post endpoint definitions, which would allow us to, if we remove this, secure just specifically this endpoint here. If we then had app.get just the root directory, for example, and we passed into that a function with a request and a response, and we did a request.json and returned an object with a message of OK, and close that off here. This endpoint here is now publicly accessible, whereas this one here is going to require authorization. Now remember how I said that the audience was just an identifier? In our case here, we're running on localhost, but our audience is still going to be dev.api.hoist.earth. So let's now create our first endpoint. We don't really want one called authorized. We want an endpoint to manifest a new Stripe customer. So let's do that. We'll put it into a user directory, manifest Stripe customer. We've got JWT check in there already, so this can only be called with a valid access token, which will contain inside it information about the Auth0 user, which we can use for this linking. We don't really want to send this response here. What we want to do instead is make a call to the management API to update the user with a new Stripe customer ID. In order to be able to call the Auth0 Management API, we need to do two things. First thing we need to do is get a JSON Web Token that allows our API to talk to the management API. This can't be the same access token because the access token generated by the user logging into the Hoist application only allows the Hoist application to talk to the Hoist API. So we're going to need to create a new access token for the Hoist API to talk to the Auth0 Management API. This is going to be a machine-to-machine client, and we're going to be using standard credentials, just a username and password essentially, for authenticating to Auth0 in order to get that JSON Web Token back. Now, there's an easy way to go about this. We could go over and have a look in the Management API documentation. We can also simply jump into the Management API here and go to the Test tab. If we click on the Create an Authorized Test Application, it's actually creating an application for us called the Auth0 Management API Test Application. And in here, it's going to give us some code that we can use to get the JSON Web Token that we're after. So let's copy this here, and we'll paste this into here. And essentially what we're doing is we have our client secret defined here, and client ID. These are automatically inserted into the live documentation from Auth0 because it knows which client we're working with. So if we run this now, we should be able to make a request to the manifest Stripe customer endpoint. We'll have to provide in a bearer token, so we'll do that, and we should get a console log out when we're running the application here and see the JSON Web Token returned. So if we save this for now and we run node index.js, the application is now listening on port 8080. Let's change that to 3000. So we'll save that and restart the service here. If we just come in and test, we do have something happening. So we've got an OK coming through here, which is the test function that we put in earlier. So that's working fine. If we made a request, however, to this endpoint, then we should get no authorization token was found. So let's jump into our Gatsby application now and create a request that will pass the correct token in. So let's put this into the account.js file. We know at this point they're already logged in, and all we want to do for now is to create a request that will allow the API to get the token. We're not going to do much more in the Gatsby app today. So we'll come up here. We've already got the user coming in from Auth0, and we're going to need to get the access token as well. So we'll request get access token silently. This will fail if the user's not logged in, which at this point they should be anyway. But it'll fail silently, which means that it allows us to continue operation, but know that they're not logged in and we don't have access to an access token. Let's define a function called createCustomer, and we'll call that getAccessToken silently. The call to this is going to return us a token. So let's just log that for now. We'll need a way of calling this method, so let's create a button down here. And if somebody clicks the button, we'll do an onClick, and we call createCustomer. So let's save that. We're reloading down here, jump back to our application and into the account page. So we'll need to log in down here. And now we have this create customer button. So let's pull up our console here so we can see what's going on in the logs. Clear that out and click on create customer. And we have here a token that's coming back. Now this doesn't look like a JSON Web Token. That's because it isn't. This is an opaque token, and it's used purely to call the endpoint that provides the user info. So we need to configure our Gatsby application to pass in the extra audience, being our API, that we need the token to be valid for. So we'll do that down here in the Gatsby browser, where we defined the various parameters here for the Auth0 provider. And we'll give another one, audience. The value of this one is going to be our dev.api.hoist.earth. So let's just put that in for now, and we'll break these out into environment variables later. If we just hit save and log out and log back in again, in fact, Gatsby is reloaded in the background, and it's now asking us to authorize. Because our audience has changed, we have to reauthorize. Now this is happening because we're running our application in a localhost environment. When we go into a production environment, this wouldn't come up for our users. So I'm just going to accept yes to this one. Let's clear this log again and hit create customer. And now we have a JSON Web Token. Let's just have a quick look at this and see what's inside. So we can see in here that it was issued by our tenant. The subject here, ending in 7379, is my user ID. And we can see back here in Hoist Earth, the 7379 is the subject that's passed in to the access token. We can see the audience is for both the API and the user info endpoint. So this is the access token passed back via Auth0 when the user logged in. We can use this to talk to our API now. So if we come back into the accounts page here, we know that the token is working for us. So using fetch, we're going to make a call to the Hoist API. Now let's define the API domain in our environment variables. It's something that React App's going to need to know about. So let's put the Gatsby prefix in front of it. We'll call this the Hoist API, and we know that that's going to be localhost. So we'll save that. I'm just going to reload Gatsby in the background so that we can start bringing that new environment variable in. And then here we're going to fetch from process.env.gatsby from the API, and we will add onto this the endpoint that we just created, which is manifest Stripe customer. Now by itself this is going to send a GET request, which is fine, but we need to add the token into the headers. So we're going to pass a second object in here, which is the options that we're going to give to fetch. And one of those option types is headers. And in headers we want to provide the authorization header, which for a JSON Web Token is a bearer token, which we pass in like this. Assuming everything's okay, we're going to get a response back, which is going to be of type JSON. And then that JSON we will just send to the console log. So let's hit save on that, and we'll run this again. Now I'm expecting an error at this point because we have a cross-origin request block. Let's have a look at the API again. So one of the issues we have is we're making a request from port 8000 to port 3000. This is going to create a cross-origin request, which by default is blocked for security purposes. So we'll need to add in here a new module, and we're going to install CORS. By default, when we implement CORS, it's going to allow any origin to make a request to the API. Because we're also securing the endpoints with JSON Web Tokens, that doesn't concern me too much, but it's something we might readdress in the future. So up here we want to now pull in CORS. And then after the app is initialized here, we're going to use CORS. So let's save that, restart Node, jump back over to our browser. Let's clear these and run create customer again. So we're making a request here now and passing in the token. Let's have a look what's happening. So we're getting an access token out here. This is the console body log. We've received the token, and as part of that is the access token. This access token, which comes all the way down to there, is the token that we use to talk from our API to the management API. Let's have a look what's inside this one. So here we see the issuer again is our Auth0 tenant. The subject here is different though. The subject now starts with I and ends in W. Now if we look over in the API, the Auth0 applications here, we have this one here that starts with I, and if we go all the way over, it ends with W. So this is actually a reference to the application that's connecting. So we can tell here that the subject is our application. It's not our user, it's the API. The audience is now for our management API, which is the /API v2 running on our tenant. Now we have this token here, we can use that to make the request. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to convert this into a promise, because down the line I imagine we're going to need to make more requests to the management API, and I don't want to duplicate this code as much. So now as a result of running this request, rather than throwing an error or console logging, let's change this so that we actually resolve or reject the promise. So if the promise now completes, we'll be returning the body, but passing it beforehand, so it'll actually be a JSON object that gets returned. So then in our endpoint down here, we can call the getManagementAPI JSON Web Token method, which returns us the entire response. And we know the token is the access token element on that response. We can use that token to make a request to the management API. So let's copy this part here again. And we'll need request in here. So now let's have a look to see what kind of request we actually need to make. We'll jump back in over here and we'll actually look at the management API documentation now. And if we jump down to the user section, we have a update a user. So we want to make a patch request to API v2 users followed by the ID. So the request here is going to be to API v2 users followed by the subject of the user, which is passed through in request.user. This is one of the other things that the Express JWT module will do. It'll automatically inject the broken down user information from that JSON Web Token that gets passed into that initial request to our API, it'll add that in as the user object on the request that gets sent in to any of our endpoint functions here. It was a patch request, so we'll change the method there. And we need to add an authorization header. Again, JSON Web Token is a bearer token. And the token we're passing in is the token we received up here. And finally, the body that we need to send in is going to be the app metadata that we want to set. And this can be any arbitrary JSON. We want to store a Stripe customer ID, so I'm just going to call it Stripe customer ID. Now, for now, we don't have any value to put in there. That'll come in the next session. So that I can see whether or not it differs for each user, I'm just going to put the subject straight back in. And finally, because we're sending JSON through in the body, we just need to define that JSON is true. And the request down here is doing the reject or resolve. That doesn't make sense anymore, so I'm just going to revert that back to the previous format we had, where we just throw the error or return the entire body back to the browser. Finally, we need to restart our API. We should be able to jump back over here. Let's just clear these out. Hit create customer. And we get a response back now saying invalid token. This is actually the response from Auth0's Management API back to our API, which is then being returned to our Gatsby application. The most likely reason for this is that the token is not allowed to update the user record. So let's jump back over to Auth0 and we'll have a look at the Auth0 Management API. It's the API we want to deal with. And have a look at the connections that we've got in the machine-to-machine section. So the test application here, starting I ending in EW, that's the actual client that we're currently using to connect. Now technically we'll want to create a separate application in here for our API, we'll get to that, but for now we can test this by making sure that the permission for this connection here allows us to update the app metadata. So we'll just select this one here, we'll come down, we'll hit update, and now we should be able to jump straight back here without any changes to the API, hit the create customer, and get a positive response back, which is the information that is now stored in the Auth0 against the Auth0 user. And we can see here that the app metadata comes through, and in fact if we look at the users now, we'll be able to load up our user and see down in the app metadata section that the new Stripe ID has been saved in there. And we've actually just used the Auth0 subject for now. So this is good. We need to do a little bit of cleanup, but we've got the end-to-end process of the data now flowing. So let's clean up a couple of things. We want to come to the applications. We've got these test applications already, and these were created automatically by Auth0. Whenever you create a new API, it will automatically create a test application for you. And for the Auth0 Management API, one isn't created automatically when you create your account, but when we went into the test tab and created the client from there, that's what was created from here. So this is the one that our API is currently connecting to. I'm going to clean this up slightly and give it a different name. We'll save that. And if we come back to our applications here, this test application here, we're not going to use. So I'm just going to remove this. So I'll copy the name, which is requested for the deletion. And now we have our applications cleaned up. We've just got the Hoist API and the Hoist Earth main application. In fact, let's rename this to Hoist API Dev. And the main reason for this is that when we're logging into systems, it'll come up as the name. The Hoist Earth name will definitely come up when we're trying to log in, and it's just for us to know when we're developing to have this assurance if we're on the development site and suddenly we're logging into the production tenant that there's an issue somewhere. Finally, we want to do a little bit of cleanup in the code here. So let's create an environment variable for the Auth0 aspects of the configuration. So we need an Auth0 domain, we need an Auth0 client ID, and we want the Auth0 client secret. Let's grab these. So the Auth0 domain is this part here. The client ID is this one here. And the secret is in here. Let's save that. And finally, in order to be able to use them in our application, we're going to use the .env module. And to use that, we simply add one line at the top. we require the .env module, and the response from that directly is the .env object, and we can call the config method on that, and the default is that it will pull everything out of the .env directory and make that available in the process.env object. We can now replace all instances of the Auth0 domain. The same with the client ID. Now, in fact, here we're generating a string for the body. I'm going to use JSON.stringify instead, so this is easier to read. I'm not going to modify this one here because it's the audience. We'll come up to a cleanup later. So let's save that, and we'll just start it up again and make sure that everything's still working as expected. We come in to here. I'll remove, let's edit the user, and we'll remove the data from here again. Now let's just hit the create customer endpoint. We get a positive response over here. And if we refresh the user information, we get the Stripe customer ID again with the Auth0 subject. One final test. I'm going to log out and I'm going to log in with a new account. So we now have access to the account section. We can see that we have a different subject here now, ending in 898B. If we look at the user in the system, we can see the new user account has been created, but there shouldn't be a Stripe user ID just yet. And if we now hit the create customer on the left-hand side, we should get a positive response on the right. And if we refresh this user, we'll get the app metadata updated with the Stripe ID, which will contain this user ID ending in 898B, which is right here. Okay, I think we're in a good position for the next stream. It'll be released in about a week, and I'm very excited to have Thor Schaaf from Stripe joining me for that. In that, we're going to be extending on the work that I've done today to connect to the Stripe API, create a customer. We'll also be defining products in the Stripe dashboard and linking up the plans that we have on our site to the products in the Stripe site so that users will be able to create ongoing subscriptions. I look forward to seeing you at that one. I hope you've had fun, and thanks for joining me. Hey, are you a web developer? Do you care about security and privacy? Are you interested in the Internet of Things? And what about videography and streaming? Well, these are just some of the things that I talk about on my channel. There's a couple of videos over here that you might be interested in, but until next time, thanks for joining me and have fun.